Hello, Valley Schuss fans. Welcome to video number 9, where Murray and I continue our conversation about the history of the resort. In this episode, we start off talking about snow grooming, and then we venture off into some other topics relating to the history of the resort. Once again, I'd like to thank Murray for taking the time to sit down with me and talk about the history of the resort. So without further ado, enjoy video number 9.
I have to tell you, Harold, before you can see me, I just bought a controlling interest in the Stetson Company.
I love it.
That's only one of several.
Well, I was gonna ask you. It's funny you wore that hat, because when I put this hat on tonight, I'm like, I'm gonna have to ask Murray if he's got to come up with something else. You had that one nice hat the other.
I have another one waiting in the background. That's for another evening.
All right. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Harold Carefit, and we're here with another episode of Valley Shush from Orangeville, Ontario, Canada, from 1960 to 1980. And you can see on the screen with me, I have again Murray Edwards with me. Murray, good evening. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
All right. So tonight we're going to move on. The last episode we talked about the when the resort installed the snowmaking equipment, and we discussed that in quite length last night in our episode. And tonight we're going to talk about the snow grooming. So I'm going to split our screen here. Some folks will probably remember at the beginning we looked at this picture here. So at the beginning, when the resort opened, this was the piece of equipment, the bombardier that you had. So this was your primary piece of equipment for doing grooming from like 60 to what time frame?
I'm not exactly sure, Harold. I've been thinking about that, but eventually, I think it was about 10 years we used that. It was our only grooming equipment, our only machine to go up and down the hill. Until we traded it in or sold it and got a Thiokol Sprite, but I couldn't tell you the year exactly, but it was probably before 1970.
Okay. So that's something I didn't realize until you just said it. So when you went to the Thiokol, the bombardier was gone. You traded it in, or it was sold?
One of the above. I'm not exactly sure.
Okay.
Well, we might even have had the two of them for a while, but I don't have that good a memory.
Okay. When I was making my notes for tonight, one of the questions I had, so in 1960 when the resort opened, in the Hockley Valley, there was ever other small ski resorts. At that time, were people doing snow grooming? So did they have a piece of equipment, and did they have something that they were calling snow grooming, or how did all that kind of progress?
Okay, before we started our ski hill, Doug Frid, who was the owner of Twin Hearths, he had a bombardier just like that. He had a different blade that I think the company his dad owned had built, slightly smaller than that. But I knew before we ever considered, making Valley Schuss about these machines. I had seen his was yellow, ours was red. But he plowed his parking lot with it, and he groomed his hill. Again, this is before I knew anything about ski resorts, but there were bombardier muskeg tractors, really never intended to go up and down ski hills. They were intended to drive on muskeg. So they really were terrible climbers. Anyway, he had one. The other ski hill in the valley that I was aware of that had something was Cedar Springs, right on the other side of the Kate's Peak from Doug Frid. They had a little John Deere bulldozer, which they had fitted. They widened the tracks by bolting 2x4s to the grouser, so they could go up and down some. But I don't think I ever saw them doing that. But I was aware they had this. Again, this is before we even imagined Valley Schuss. So we were the second, I'll call it the second bombardier muskeg tractor in the valley. I don't think Hockley Hills had anything like that, but I may be wrong. I wasn't around there all that much.
So were they doing, so they had the same piece of equipment, But did they have something that they towed behind as far as the grooming aspect that
Well,
was?
they would have had something they towed behind. I mean, the thing is not much good to you unless you got some sort of a roller behind it.
Okay. And was that just something that individually people built for their own specifications, or was there something on the market at that time?
Nothing on the market. Doug's father owned this manufacturing business in Hamilton, or construction business, I should say. They would have built him whatever he wanted, including the blade for the front of it and some kind of a roller for the back of it. I don't remember even seeing the darn things, but I knew he had one. Later, I watched him many times plowing his parking lot with this thing. It was not as convenient as ours, but it worked
Okay.
for plowing. His plow was smaller, and he had to kind of stand up almost in the cockpit of the thing, which was very inconvenient. Less so than ours, but we both had Bombardier Muskeg tractors for a number of years.
Okay. So when the resort opened, you had this machine, but did you have a roller or anything for snow grooming for the first couple seasons, or how'd that go?
Well, I think we had one right away because we knew that you had to have a roller. It was just not rocket science. You had to have a roller because if you drove up and down, there was this big bump in between the tracks and it didn't fly. So we must have had somebody, a local welder, make our first roller for the first year. Now, I don't think we ever had no roller at all, at least as long as the one we had was still usable. There were times when we didn't have a roller because we'd broken both of our rollers or whatever. But it was really necessary to have some sort of roller, especially if it was wide enough to cover both of the tracks. The trails from the tracks were problematic for skiers.
Right.
So you had to have a roller that was at least as wide as the Bombardier, which is about 7 feet, maybe 6 feet. I'm not sure.
Okay. So at that time, I guess in the industry, was that the common practice using a roller, or was that just something that you guys came up with that was kind of going around in that area?
I'm quite certain that Blue Mountain and a few others who were in the business before us, they would have necessarily have to build some sort of a roller.
Okay. Yeah, because I know today it seems like it's they don't really have it's not compacting, it's more of it's kind of
It's tilling.
yes, tilling. Yep,
A
that's
completely, absolutely, incredibly different thing.
Do you think that would have made a big difference at all back then if you would have had the tilling aspect as opposed to the rolling?
Well, the simple answer is yes. The towing machine, the Bombardier and even Thiokol could not have pulled that. However, I have a kind of an anecdotal story. That Bombardier would only pull a roller or a drag of some sort. We had various things we dragged behind it that did not roll, they just dragged. They were basically farm equipment, like a harrow of various sorts. But at some point, probably as a result of somebody, probably Dad, reading something in some sort of ski resort magazine about these things, we called it a rototiller at the time, what digs up gardens.
Right.
Some guy somewhere in Southern Ontario had modified or even built himself, I think, a small rototiller, maybe 3 feet wide with a little gas engine on it. It powered itself. And we borrowed or rented one for a day. I can remember seeing it on Murray's Run, not doing a very good job, but we were pretty excited about this notion of a tiller because it was really hard with that Bombardier to make the snow soft. If you were packing it down, it got hard. Anyway, I remember we rented this thing. Some guy was, he was going to make $1 million selling these to everybody. I don't know where that went, but eventually, many years later, these powered tillers, various types. Some had, fixed teeth. Some had flexible teeth. The whole industry completely changed when those things came along.
Yeah, I could see how that would make
For better and worse, I would say.
Yeah, I would think for especially icy stuff that would be able to chew it up.
Well, man-made snow is not snow; it's ice.
Yeah.
Okay, and it was really hard, and you had to till it. You could not really expect skiers to be happy if you did not till it.
Yep, that definitely makes sense. We kind of briefly touched on this last night, but as far as the plow, so if I understood you right last night, that wasn't really something that you really used a whole lot in the grooming process. So when you were making, when you were making the snow, I'm not sure if the bombardier was still around, but it was not really used in the grooming process at all, the plow.
Well, okay, I'll answer that as someone who did both. That was mainly like 99.9% of the time, it was a snow plow to plow the parking lot. Okay?
Yeah.
So it was held up by two hydraulic cylinders, one on each side. I think they were controlled separately, so you could lower one edge of the blade a little more than the other. But it was pretty cumbersome and rudimentary. In any case, we used it mainly for plowing parking lots. But I remember one time I had alluded to the freezing up of certain parts of Murray's Run due to the water, coming out of the ground. I remember plowing tiny little bits of snow for hour after hour after hour, 1 or 2 nights, from the dry, non-frozen parts of Murray's Run down this tiny little pathway just to get skiers past that long section of ice. So I would get this tiny little bucket load of snow. That blade had wings on it, so you could actually hold a certain amount of snow between the two wings. They're not in that picture, but
Okay.
They help various ways. But it really was I guess a beginning go at least for bombardiers, moving snow on the ski trail. But it was really cumbersome and really slow, and the thing was always freezing cold because there was never a heater of any sort in it.
Yeah, I can imagine. Wow.
Yeah, I'm glad I still have my fingers and toes alive, but I endured an incredible amount of cold.
That's amazing. They didn't have any type of heat.
No,
Was that, but I mean, in fairness, was that thing really designed more to you, like you were saying, in the muskegs, more probably in
well, I mean, muskeg can be cold or hot. The muskeg was usually unfrozen when you had to have a track vehicle to get to some poor person who had suffered some injury or something or other. I mean, it was early in the industry, but the Tucker snowcat that was around at that time was a completely different animal. In lots of ways, better design. It was sure a lot more expensive, but we were just sort of winging it, trying to figure out what to do with these ski hills.
Yeah. I would imagine the Tucker snowcat was more introduced out west. Or was there some in Canada as well?
Well, it was built out west. No, I know for sure when we started in 1960, Blue Mountain, for sure, they would have had a Tucker snowcat. Okay. And others may have, but I didn't know much about the business even, let alone who had what. But they were around. They just cost about twice as much as this thing, and they were did twice as much work.
Yeah. I'm assuming they were a lot more capable too, like you were saying with the Bombardier was pretty much going downhill. You weren't climbing up.
Well, they could climb, and we could barely get up the hill at certain times. And there are many times I couldn't even get up the hill. I had to, whatever. I'll tell you more about that later. But it was not a great climber.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just looking at the tracks, you can tell there's not a lot of.
Well, it was very heavy. I used to have to go up almost all the time up the Caribou, the easy trail, to get to the top, and then go down Murray's Run or other ski trails. And I never went up Murray's Run all the way because it just wouldn't go.
Right.
It would spin. The tracks would spin and you'd be stuck. You had to turn around and go back down, and dug a hole in the meantime.
Yeah. So you probably ended up making a big mess once you get.
Well, yeah.
I could see that happening. All right. Well, let me transition then. So that was the Bombardier was like we were talking about here, probably for the first.
I think it was around for at least 7 years, maybe 10.
Okay.
To be fair, it would have been better. I mean, I wish I knew when we sold it, but it plowed the parking lot way better than the Thiokol did. And there's a Thiokol with no blade, and I can't remember ever having that Thiokol with no blade.
So typically it did have a blade on the front of it.
Well, I'm not sure what typical means, but we bought it apparently without a blade, and then we somehow got a blade, but
Okay,
I don't have that good a memory.
gotcha. I'm
We may
assuming,
have had it for a while without a blade and then realized we really had to have a blade, and people were making such things at the time, so we got one. Well,
okay,
it did not have, now that I think of it, that picture you've got there, it probably did not have hydraulics front or back at that time. I say front or back because on the front it would have run a blade, on the back it would have done various things to things you towed, like these things we called powder makers. So they required hydraulics on the back end.
right, okay.
So I can't really, I wish I could, but I can't really tell you whether it had either at that time. Probably it did have, could have had both, but I don't even remember seeing it without a blade on it.
I'm assuming then you just pulled the roller behind this once you got this piece of equipment?
Well, early on, we just pulled a roller, but very soon we got one of these things called a powder maker, which was basically a pair of two rollers, but they weren't slatted like the early rollers were. They were made of what's called expanded metal. You take a big sheet of steel and make a bunch of cuts in it and stretch it. And it was this thing that kind of chewed up the snow way more effectively than anything else at the time could do. So they were a marvel,
Okay,
powder maker.
but they were not hydraulically operated?
Yes, there were two of them, one behind the other on our first iteration, and you could control the angle. These things would they'd roll straight ahead just like a roller, or if you cocked them a little bit, one would be on an angle, as opposed to the other. So they would move the snow a little bit sideways as you moved up and down, as well as kind of chopping it up into smaller pieces. Eventually, we got a bigger, wider one that had three rollers on it, which was much better. The original one only covered almost the width of the tracks of the Zydeco, which is problematic because you had to go up and down more times than you wanted to. So
Right.
it was an evolving technology.
Well, that was another question I had. So at the beginning, when you were, let's just say the beginning with the bombardier and the roller, how long would it take you to groom all the trails?
Way too long. I don't know. To drive from the chalet to the top of the hill. Oh my gosh, Harold.
I mean, basically, were you out there all night long from sundown to sunup, basically trying to get?
Many nights,
Okay.
or all day and all night. I mean, it took endless time. In our case, we only had one run going down. Murray's Run was that. There were a couple of others, but to get up, you had to go up the Caribou. Later on, I could figure out how to get most of the way up Murray's Run and turn around and come down, but I never could go up the top with the bombardier. With the Thiokol, yes, I could do that, but only occasionally. So going up the Caribou early on would have been 10 minutes at least to get up.
Okay.
Really slow, maybe 15 sometimes. And, then down was a lot faster because you're going faster.
Right.
It was a very slow process. It's why I drive slowly now, Harold, because I know what it's like to drive slowly. And I've driven several million miles in those machines.
With the Thiokol, could you groom uphill with that one, or would
Yes,
you have to?
if it was not really steep. So I developed a technique that involved, in the case of Murray's Run, which was, it had the width of the trail varied quite considerably. So at the very top, it was narrow, and then it widened out, and then it was narrow. But I figured out after a number of years of doing this that I could go up Murray's Run almost to the top of the hill on one side, like right near the right side, I'll say, and turn around just below the top of the hill, go back down and do a couple of long, narrow circles, each one smaller. And then when I was nearly done, I would go all the way to the top and down over the mess that I left where I had to turn around. It's kind of like the snowmaking. It required a lot of technique and experimentation and patience, but I learned to do it really well. I mean, I still talk to people about, they say, what's your education? I said, I got a whole bunch of PhDs, and the main one is in slope grooming.
Lots of practice.
Yeah, but snowmaking too.
Yeah.
So,
I
I
think,
mean, the fact is that was my job. So I tried to do the best I could.
right. I know in a previous episode we talked, or you mentioned, so there was a couple, or let me put it this way, with the thiokol, was there a hill that you did not groom or not able to groom?
Well, I guess you could say yes to that. But again, the rules of where you could ski and where you could not ski evolved slowly, I guess partly with, the grooming angle, but for
Well,
sure, people would ski down trails that we had not groomed.
yeah, but I mean, as far as the established trails, what was the steepest one? Was that the Wildcat?
Well, that was not there in the very beginning. That was several years after we started. But I was never able to groom the very top of that. Never.
Okay, even with the thiokol?
I may have gone down there once. Actually, I did, but this is a joke in the industry. If I had gone to the top of the Wildcat, the top was like extremely steep. But once you started over the edge, if the snow slided with you, you were in the middle of an avalanche.
Gotcha.
A small avalanche, and the machine would just slide. It wouldn't track. It would just slide along with the snow. And it wasn't going to tip over or anything. Like, it was quite exciting, but it was kind of wasteful because it just dragged the snow with it.
Yeah, no, I can appreciate
But
it.
the rest of the Wildcat, we were able to groom, but it was really bumpy. We never bulldozed it, so it was really quite, topsy-turvy, I'll say.
So when you say never bulldozed it, so you essentially just cut the trees, made the trail, and then that was it.
Yeah, and cleared the wood away. We never did bulldoze the Wildcat, to my knowledge, or the Pussycat.
Okay.
We did Murray's Run, but later, I mean, everybody was, ripping the heck out of these hills with bulldozers because, that's what you had to do. But we didn't have a lot of money to do that early on.
Yeah. Well, I'm assuming then all you did is cut the trees down, pull the stumps out, and then that was it.
We didn't pull the stumps out. The stumps stayed there. You just cut them down to the ground with a chainsaw as close as you could go and hope it would snow a lot.
Okay. All right.
I mean, to be fair, the Wildcat, when the first few years it was there, it was probably only skied on for, 10 days a year. I don't know the details on that, but I mean, there wasn't a lot of snow.
Right. Yeah, just depending on how the winter went, dictated.
Well, yeah, the winters were never, ever heavy snow. Never.
Yeah, it was
Not a great place for a ski hill.
right. As far as
it was not Colorado.
Yeah. But like we were talking about last night, even on that side of the resort, there wasn't really any snowmaking anyway. So
I don't think we ever made snow on the Wildcat.
yeah. The other thing as we were talking with the grooming, as far as the snowmaking, did you ever move snow? Like once you had the snow guns and you were making snow, did you ever like take advantage of the snow there and then try moving it somewhere else?
We never moved it at a great distance, but once we got the blade on the thiokol, which was only about a foot high and just a little wider than the thiokol itself, and you could angle it to one side or the other a little bit. There were two little levers in front of the driver, one to lift it and one to angle it. Very cumbersome, but they did work. So you had to go really slowly. And I can remember quite clearly going down various runs, usually in the middle of the night, but not always, and angling it to one side or another, because I mentioned this earlier, when skiing happens, the snow tends to move from the center of the run to the edges of the run. For reasons I can explain later, I guess, but there was always more snow at the edge of the run. So I would go down, let's say the left side of a run going downhill, and the blade would be angled to the right so I could move the snow from the edge of the run towards the center of the run on both sides. So then I could groom that snow that I had somehow stolen from the edges of the run, because there's always, a shortage of snow. There's never enough snow. but we never did make big piles of snow and move it around because that machine just wouldn't do it.
Okay.
And then later on, I mean, everybody else was doing it, but this is a small, low budget ski hill.
Okay. How was this machine as far as the maintenance and maintaining it? I know you told me some of the challenges with the
Well, it
Bombardier,
was much more modern, and it was light because the whole darn thing, the frame, the cab and the frame were aluminum, like about a quarter of the weight of the Bombardier. Similar size of an engine, only one roll of bogies under the tracks, whereas the Bombardier had two. It was about at least half or less of the weight of the Bombardier.
Okay.
Much lighter and much faster, although you never really went very fast, although you could. But it was a huge advance for us.
Right. Was that as far as the drivetrain and the transmission, was it an automatic or what? How did that? I don't.
Oh,
remember.
no, I don't think standard transmissions were standard at the time. And the arrangement was the engine was at the back and the transmission was like basically close to the front, and the sprockets were at the front. The reason for that is that when you're driving a track, you would know this from your bulldozer history, but I know bulldozers often were driven at the back, but if your sprockets at the front are pulling the track, they want to, how does it go? You don't want the track to get loose at any part of its travel. So to be fair, early on, they were pretty well all driven at the front. And yeah, I could talk more about that if I had time to think about it. But basically, the Bombardier and the Thiokol were driven from the front. Now, I know there have been machines, probably all of them now are driven at the back, but I couldn't talk about that right now.
Okay. Was this cab heated?
Yes, it did have heat, mercifully.
So it was a little bit more comfortable, or
It was a lot more comfortable, and
Yeah.
you could get two people in it. Yeah, it was much more comfortable.
Okay. I'm trying to, the one thing I don't remember. So how did you? It's like as far as the controls for steering it or driving it. So
Well, they were both standard transmissions. In the Bombardier, right between your legs, right by your crotch, there was two little levers that controlled the transmission, one for forward and one for reverse. The Thiokol had a big stick on your right hand. You could see it sticking up there, and you could shift gears with that. You rarely shifted gears, although sometimes from one to another. And each time up the hill and down, you might shift once or twice. It wasn't like a car where you shift three times. It went at a certain speed, and that was the speed that was, most efficient, and hardly ever shifted. But it was a standard transmission.
how about steering it when you want to turn it?
Oh, both the Bombardier and the Thiokol had different arrangements, but you pulled one lever and it would break the one track, and you pull the other lever and it breaks the other track. And if you pulled both of them, it break both tracks.
So just like a bulldozer.
Well, yeah, but it wasn't a clutch; it was a brake. The bulldozers have clutches.
Okay. All right, but kind of the same.
Yeah, the same feeling.
feeling. Okay.
And if you pulled really hard on one endlessly, you'd go around in circles.
Right. Okay. Was it a pretty nice machine to drive and operate?
Well, yeah,
Pretty
compared to the
easy.
Bombardier for sure. But I'm just thinking about that. There was this dance you could do with the thing. Like I'm going up Murray's Run, okay, and I get near the top of the hill, and I know I can't go any farther. I go as far as I can, and I pull on one of the levers, and it turns, but I can make it slide sideways as well as turn. And it was like a ballet.
Mm-hmm.
It was really quite fun. And you got very good at it, or not so, but it took practice. And you could do things with it that, people would look at it and say, how the hell did you do that?
Right. Yeah, no,
You could even slide sideways all the way down the hill. If you parked it across the hill at the top and did the right things, you could slide way down, just going sideways really fast.
Yeah.
It was not something you wanted to do, but it was a performance. You could do it.
Right. Yeah, I mean that makes sense with the way that the tracks, if you're going sideways. So, Yeah, that's interesting. That was,
Yeah.
I do remember.
Maybe that's why I came to be a performer. I like to play with the thing, and mostly there was nobody around, but occasionally you'd scare the hell out of people by doing
Right.
things like that.
I'm assuming that for the most part, then you try to have all the grooming done, and you were off the hills by the time people
Yeah,
started.
there were the reliability concerns, Harold, early on, not the beginning, but you had to be really careful. You did not want anyone to come from behind you and past you, or you certainly didn't want to drive over someone. And there were a couple of people killed in circumstances like that in the industry, and the insurance industry loved it because they could sue, 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 sue. It was
Right.
the bane of the industry.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah,
To be
that's
fair, if you got injured by one of those things, you're going to sue.
yeah. So I'm just looking at the headlights on it. What was it? Fairly easy at nighttime with the lights on, since
Well, it was, except that when you had the blade down, or when the blade was on the machine, you couldn't see in front of the blade because it was in shadow.
Gotcha.
Subsequent machines had lights way up on the top, front, and back. We did have a light on the back, as I recall. I think you can even see it there. So if you're
Okay,
pulling
yeah.
a snow machine, you can see it behind you. There
Yeah.
were always, well, that's an early picture of the Cycle, because we always had big mirrors, like truck mirrors. I guess we installed them so I could see behind me,
Okay.
but without turning my head around.
Gotcha.
That's a really early picture of the Cycle.
Well,
In fact, that may have been the first book.
Yeah, just looking at this picture, what year did this like the I guess the garage here, and then
The
this?
first addition to the chalet was the addition that had the apartment that Mom and Dad lived in, and the hot stove room. The second addition was on the opposite side. It was a basement only. That we built a little place we could get the bombardier inside and the rentals. So that would have, the first addition would have been, I'm guessing here, 62, the first one, 63 or 4, the second one, 65 or 6 or 7, that one. And that never
Okay.
did have a second story on it. It was designed to be a parking lot on the top and the shop below. We
Yeah,
really needed the shop.
because I just think for me personally, as I'm thinking back, I always remember that being there. So that's kind of a
That's right.
reference.
It would have been around 1970, and we could get that Cycle in, just squeak it in under the overhead. I can remember changing the oil in that and working on the tracks inside, and it was a real, it was a great thing to be able to do it inside because we had electric heat in there and it was warm. Otherwise, the bombardier was outside and it was really cold.
So how big was that garage? Was it basically the full size, whatever the parking pad was?
The full length of that building, I can tell you, was 55 feet from end to end, and from side to side, 25, maybe a little more. That machine would go in and it would be 8 feet long. So there's room at the front and the back, let's say about 20 by 55, as I recall. The whole length of that thing was 55 feet.
Okay. Did you guys have a lot of
And there
other?
were like 4 bays, 2 in the center that had doors, and the one on either side did not have doors. So it was basically a 4-bay shop. Divide 55 by 4 and you got it.
Okay. Did you always have a lot of stuff in there? I don't really remember spending a whole lot of time in
Well, the
that.
stuff accumulated in time, but originally there was just room for the machines. But I remember building my very first workbench. If I'd gone in the left-hand door, I think that's actually it. But we built workbenches all along the walls pretty much as we could, because we've always wanted to put stuff on them and do things. So it gradually developed into a full-blown workspace, which if you really, well, you could get both machines in there, and I don't know, maybe the Bombardier and the Cycle both went in at one time. I'm not sure about that, but you could get the Cycle and a truck in there if you really wanted to. So
Okay.
it was really nice shop.
Yeah.
Concrete floor and electric heat, 2 big electric heaters. They must have been terribly inefficient, but they heated the place.
Right. Was there who else did snow grooming? Were you the primary guy, or was there some other folks that helped you as well?
Well, if I wasn't there, somebody else had to do it. And What I know is my friend Gordon Henry did quite a bit at times, probably several other people would have done some grooming. And I again, if I wasn't there, I didn't know, but there would have been several people who did some, but for sure I did, the lion's share of the grooming early on. Later on, I'm not even sure who did it later on.
Okay. Towards the end, when I say the end, towards 1980, or if you want to just put it this way, as we kept progressing through the 70s, getting closer to 1980, were you any less hands-on, or were you pretty much the same way, during the 70s up until 1980, or did your amount of time at the resort fluctuate,
That's
change?
hard to answer. It's hard to answer that, Harold. I was almost from the beginning loath to take on management roles. And I was also, I knew I did not want to spend my life running a ski resort. So I slowly withdrew myself, and I was often available because I didn't have other work, and Dad and I worked together, doing this sort of thing. So if he needed somebody and I was available, I'd do it. I knew how to do everything. So it's kind of, it's kind of a weird situation, but I was not preparing to do this for the rest of my life. I was preparing to not do it for the rest of my life.
Okay.
So, I was good at it, but I did not want to do it forever. And Dad understood that.
Right. And I know we talked about this before, but during this whole process, your dad is an owner, but he was always there for in the background as the owner, giving advice and help, making sure that everything,
Yeah. I mean,
even though you had a manager.
Well, I remember very little about what Hans did, to be honest. I remember very little about what he did. So I always figured I was, my dad's worker.
Yeah. So
I don't think Hans still, again, I wasn't the only person there. Gordon Lennox probably did a whole bunch of this stuff that I never even saw.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
He was probably not quite as good at it as I, but I don't even know that for sure.
Yeah. Well, I could just see whoever spent more time, doing it would definitely.
I would have done the lion's share of the grooming over the whole period, right up to the end, almost. I know when it became a private club, the last few years, I do recall very distinctly getting up at 2 or 3 in the morning, getting over there because I didn't live there, getting in that machine and running up and down until 9 o'clock in the morning when the ski lift started. And I had it timed, so I knew what needed to be done and how long it would take and whatever. And I'd kind of stop at the top of the hill. I'd watch the sunrise over the top of the hill, and I'd wait up there for somebody to say, "Hey, Murray, what a great job you did." It happened 2 times. I did it day after day after day all winter because the private club people were much more fussy, and they were paying the bills, and they said, "We want that ski hill to be skiable first thing in the morning. Don't do it late at night or early in the other day because it's hard in the morning. We want it soft. We want to, get on a pillow every day." So I would do it for them.
Okay. So that just when you said it, just made me think of a couple of questions. So towards the end of the 70s, there was a definite changeover to where it went to our private club.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Now,
it wasn't sudden because early on, the business was never making much money. So we did what we could. And Toronto Ski Club, late 60s, early 70s, I suppose, they had a deal with Blue Mountain. They had their own section of Blue Mountain. So they would, the ski club people would ski there. They had a great big long pommel lift. And a bunch of those people somehow arranged with Valley Schuss to have a secondary nearer to Toronto, half as far as Blue Mountain. So they had privileges of some sort at Valley Schuss. So it was the beginning of what became a private club, or almost. It was never totally private. but they had some sort of privileges. And there was a regular people who bought memberships every year. So there's a group of stalwart supporters. And then that eventually, when the business was going to fail, it was going to tank, it was offered for sale. And I can tell you a bit about that. But the people, the group who were annual members, they were offered the opportunity to make an offer to buy the whole thing. And I can remember some outfit from Arizona offered to buy the whole thing, and they offered way more money than this group did. And Dad and I guess Harold, I don't remember who was involved in this, but they said, we don't want somebody from America to buy this place. We'll sell it to this group for a whole lot less. And they did. So the private club group bought it. And I can tell you more about that, but that happened in a couple of phases, but eventually it was owned by this group, which, when the fire happened, they had to fold eventually.
Yeah. So, I mean, so during this process, I'm assuming they kept your father in basically his same role, even though I'm assuming.
Yeah, pretty much. They really could not have done it without him. But at that stage, he was already easing himself out of Timberland Ellicott, for whom he had worked for a few years, 3 or 4 years, full time. He was easing into being their sales wing. They did not want to employ somebody to sell their ski lifts, and Dad was the guy who knew how to do it. So he said, look, I'll form my own company. I'll sell your ski lifts and, install them if that comes around. And he and I did a lot of that, and also, get into business with Murray in a small way, being consultants. And then we were into snowmaking at that point. So selling snowmaking equipment and, selling snowmaking systems and building them. So this was not a huge business, but we both did it, and there was lots to do. So he was able to be more time at Valley Schuss, a lot more time at Valley Schuss. And he also did this Lloyd Evers equipment sales, it was called. So at the same time, he managed Valley Schuss, I think, until the very end, and, pulled a lot of strings and did good things for them that no one else could have done, like including buy that T-bar that from Twin Hearths, and, broker deals like that. So he was a broker.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I could definitely see how he would have a lot of influence on being able to help them out. So was there a time when it actually changed hands to, so in other words, our fathers purchased the property, was when the ski club took over, did they go to the bank and got financing, and essentially it was no longer, our fathers, it was officially, in the hands of the ski club? You remember that?
Well, vaguely. And again, I was never, ever involved in the financial matters of this company. Okay.
Right.
I always thought it was owned by the bank. I had a vague notion that your father had put in more money than my father had, but that's about all I knew.
Okay.
I didn't even know the numbers. But eventually it was clear to everyone that the business, Carhays in Brantford, was going to go under. And that Harold would, subsequent to that, I think he said, look, Lloyd, we're going to have to sell this place, or you're going to have to buy it, or something's going to have to happen, because I have to get out. That's what I remember. That's when you guys all moved to Ohio.
Right.
Now, this is not official, accurate information, but at that point, everybody was on notice that, okay, what do we do now? Well, that's when Toronto Ski Club probably entered as a little bit of a short-term aid. And then we would sell more memberships and, scurry around and try and do stuff. I mean, sure, it was always just no money to run the place, just enough to keep it going. And then eventually it had to be put on the market for sale. And that's when this outfit, as I recall, from Arizona, some guy who owned another ski resort, made an offer. And I can remember Dad talking about this. I never spoke to your father about this because he was not there.
Right.
And Dad said, well, okay, I don't really want to sell it to some American company. And I mean, I'm sure he was in consultation with Harold about this and the bank. So the nub of that was that eventually this group of members were on notice. Well, you want to ski or you don't want to ski. Pony up if you want to ski. So they
Right.
found the money to do it.
That's fascinating somebody from Arizona, I mean, for such a small little ski resort, I mean, like you said, it wasn't a moneymaker. It wasn't like there was some jewel that they like, wow, look at this.
Well, the person from Arizona, I don't think he ever went there, but at that time, people were still building ski resorts. Now
Yeah.
they're a dime a dozen. You could buy 3 of them tomorrow, Harold, for $1 million.
Yeah. As long as I win the lottery. That I did not know did not know that aspect of another potential buyer. Is there as far as the Toronto Ski Club? So after the chalet burned down, did they move on to somewhere else?
Well, actually, to be fair, the Toronto Ski Club as such probably was not a major player in the scene. I couldn't say that authoritatively. They may well have had their finger in, like, let's say, privileges to ski. You know, members of the Toronto Ski Club could probably ski at a reduced rate at Valley Schuss for the last few years when it was nominally owned by what we'll call a private club. I mean, I don't think it was ever a completely private. I guess it was, actually, now that I think of it, at the end. I mean, everybody was, all the ski resorts in Ontario became private clubs except 1 or 2 eventually.
Yeah, that's the only way they could stay in
Too
business.
expensive. Poor people couldn't ski there. You had to be rich to ski.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of interesting when you look back. I mean, as I think I was reading an article to where, you know, as the industry got so commercialized, right? And in one way, it shut down a bunch of the small ski resorts because of the commercialization and how big they were. But if I understood what this guy was getting at in his article was then, you know, 20 or 30 years later, people were yearning for that small ski resort experience again, where they didn't want the huge lines. They didn't want the super expensive stuff. They just wanted something close that wasn't far away. So it's almost like, you know, the way that the industry started being small ski resorts, right?
They were called clubs at that time.
Clubs, yeah. And it's kind of funny because the guy made it sound like a lot of people were kind of wanting to go back to that. You know, they didn't like the big commercial ski resorts.
Well,
so
Harold, between you and me, I'm so happy to hear you say that, because I watched the whole thing from 1960 on and said, I don't want to be part of this. This is a big industry. I don't really like the feeling of being a cog in a wheel.
yeah.
And it got, well, ours didn't get all that big. It never really was terribly big, but I watched the whole scene and bigger ski lifts and more of this and more of that, and you know, cost. And I said, I'm going to get out of this. I don't want to do this. But I've always felt small scale, low impact, local, near town, tiny ski hills are the only way to go.
Yeah. There was actually, I was doing some research and I don't have the name, but I did find there is a resort there in Ontario. I'm pretty sure it's in Ontario that is a you know, the same concept of what they were doing, you know, 40 or 50 years ago. It was just all member owned, and I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head.
I'd like to know more about that, because honestly, the evolution, maybe not the right word, but the changes that skiing has gone through in my lifetime, they're pretty dramatic, really. But I mean, as far as I can tell, that business will die because it will just cost too much to do it.
Yeah, no, I'm almost sure it's still. When I was looking, it didn't look like it was something that was in the past. So I'll research that some more and I'll get you.
Yeah, that'd be good. But I think I mentioned to you earlier this outfit called Knapp Associates, KNAPP Associates. A guy named Hugh Knapp. Way back into the 60s, he was brokering deals to, like, we probably bought that Sayakal through Hugh Knapp, because he was the wheeler. You know, he was from Eastern United States, and for years and years, maybe even still, he brokers originally equipment and then eventually ski resorts. He was brokering ski resort sales in the 70s, maybe in the 80s. I don't know, but Knapp Associates was the name of his outfit. I don't think I met him, but I certainly knew of him and, followed his newsletter. We used to get it all the time. We used to
Okay.
get Ski Resort Management magazine. You can find them in a library probably, but, I read them avidly for years.
Do you ever remember as like when you guys purchased the SMI equipment, were you guys ever featured in a magazine, or was there any kind of write-ups about like, hey, this resort bought this piece of equipment or doing something?
I don't think so, but I wouldn't, I kind of doubt that. I
Okay.
mean, we were a small player, to be fair, but Dad was the agent for SMI for Eastern Canada, maybe even Western. I know he went out to one or two resorts in the West during that time period to try and sell, massive snowmaking systems for SMI. Again, he was involved in ways that I'm not all that aware of.
Yeah. I'll have to look into that. As far as your dad, there might be something that has a mention of him since. Like,
well, okay, this is one case in point. There's a place near Banff, Alberta, which is, skiing heaven for Westerners. A place called Whitehorn, which was a massive mount in a national park, which wanted a snowmaking system, which involved like multi-millions of dollars to do it. And I know Dad went out there, flew out there and looked at it and came back. I'm imagining this, but I think he was probably shaking his head and said, this is way above our head. And that would have been us being SMI and whatever, Dad resources he had. But I don't think that ever happened. Like, it's really expensive stuff, and it's in a territory where you have to be very environmentally aware. And God knows what it costs. I don't know.
Yeah. I think I do remember your dad, and this may have been kind of in relationship to the story you were talking about. But I thought I remember him telling me stories about how big some of the equipment is that he, either knew that they were using, building resorts, but, like back then it was probably like the D9. And then I also thought I remember him telling me a story about them using a helicopter to, move around the lift
I can
towers.
tell you quite a bit about that story. I have
Yeah.
a picture here from a newspaper at that time. There's a place called Sunshine Village. Do you know where Banff, Alberta is?
Oh yeah. Yep.
Okay, so near Banff, Alberta, in the national park, is a ski hill called Sunshine Village. It's quite up high. You have to go up this long road, even in buses at the time we did that, to get there because, it was colder up high. Timberland Ellicott sold, I guess I'm going to call it a Skyway chairlift. They only made 3 or 4 chairlifts. But this would be, I think it was the winter I was in Europe, like 64, 65. Dad spent months in Banff trying to, somehow Timberland Ellicott took on not just the sale of the equipment, but the installation, or at least the supervision of the installation. And Dad did that. And it was so high up that this is, these things get ordered too late. And in December, you're trying to fly with a great big tower underneath you, and the helicopters couldn't get there because the air was too thin. As a helicopter driver, that the higher up you go, the thinner the air gets.
Yeah.
So they're hauling these towers, and they have to bring them down and cut them in half and get welders in to make means to cut, bolt them together.
Yeah. I
Took
don't.
forever.
I don't remember that. I think what I remember, he was telling me about the static electricity. I think
Well,
he
I
was
mean, that's
telling
the
me
only place ever where helicopters were used, at least in our history,
Yeah.
and mine. So that would have been in Banff, Alberta, at Sunshine Village,
Yeah.
which is still there.
Yeah. Because
I don't think the lift is still there.
Yeah, it's a phenomenon a lot of people don't understand with the rotor system on a helicopter. And
Why would they understand?
yeah, but back then, obviously, I was just a little kid, but it was fascinating when your dad was kind of telling me that story, because I think what
Yeah.
happened is somebody ended up getting the shocked pretty good or whatever. And
Well, I don't even remember the story about static electricity, but it kind of adds up.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, basically, if you got a helicopter with a long line underneath it, and you're lowering that down for somebody to grab it to attach to something, you have to ground it first because the rotor system generates static electricity.
Okay.
And if you grab it, you're going to be the grounding item as opposed to.
Okay.
So,
All right.
yeah,
That's a new for me, but I can see how it would happen.
yeah,
Well, anyway, he was the engineer on the site, and he would have consulted with other people for sure. And I'm sure they're all tearing their hair out wanting this thing to run. And it was December and January before it ran.
right.
I rode on it subsequently, years later. I actually rode on that chairlift.
Oh, interesting. All right, I know we're getting close to our time. There's one other thing I just wanted to go over with you real quick, and then we'll close for this evening. But my brother brought this to my attention. So when my father moved to the States here, he was working for a company, and they built I'm going to call it like a snow machine, or and I think you guys nicknamed it the Lobster. Do you remember that contraption that my dad had built down here in the States with some company he was working with?
The company was called Foxtrac, Foxtrac.
Okay.
And we took, I guess it was delivered from Ohio, what I would consider to be a prototype.
Yes.
Which had certain features that were great, a lot of them were not, and everybody else was making these things at the time. So we got this Foxtrac, we called it the Lobster, and it might even have been the name that had been, given it by the company that built it. But I remember, oh, Harold has this thing and he doesn't know what to do with it, so we'll take it up to Orangeville. And we nursed it along. It wasn't the greatest machine, but I drove it a number of times. It would even go backwards, which other snowmobiles did not do at the time. Very slow and clunky, but I can see it right now in my mind's eye.
Yeah. No, when my brother John reminded me that we had it like sitting in our garage. So I guess whenever it was done, and then we were holding on to it. So it must have been like in the late fall. And I think the plan was once winter arrived, then we were going to take it up to Orangeville. But I remember sitting on it in my garage. And then
I remember selling it or giving it away years and years later to some guy in Uxbridge, Ontario, who had a whole bunch of old snowmobiles. He collected them.
Yeah.
I just gave it to him.
Yeah, I remember my brother telling me it really wasn't, very successful, or
no, it wasn't.
Whatever. So.
I mean, it was innovative in some ways, which were great. It had a good, everybody had some good ideas.
Yeah.
Now they all go a million miles an hour, and you don't groom ski hills with them.
Right.
There's lots of them around here. If you're a man, you have a snowmobile around here.
Yeah. No, it's just something, when my brother was talking about it, it's like, oh, geez. It's like, I totally forgot about it. But then once he said something, it's like, oh, I definitely remember it. I don't ever remember when we dropped it off, ever riding on it or driving it, but
Harold, if this thing we're doing goes very far, we will probably turn up somebody in the next few years who has a picture of it.
Yeah, that would be cool.
It was about the same color as the Thiokol. It was kind of orange colored.
Yep.
I can remember a guy who we employed at the time who was a good mechanic, and he was futzing around with the thing, trying to get this and that to work. It had I'll call it a hydrostatic transmission. You didn't have to shift gears. It had this little, what's the right word? Anyway, like an automatic transmission. You didn't have to use a lever to shift gears.
Yeah.
But it was rudimentary and early in the history of that type of thing. But it was innovative in its own way. I don't know where Foxtrac went. The company probably never sold another one.
That's interesting. I never knew the official name of it. So
Foxtrac.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that.
Check that out.
Yeah.
We find that interesting.